World's number one, Magnus Carlsen, is back in action at the World Cup. As in the fourth round, he is playing against Germany's number one, Vincent Keymer. And Magnus going into this match as the huge favorite. He has an overwhelming score. He has won 14 games. Okay, a lot of online games and rapid and blitz games included. But in the two classical games they have played before, he also managed to win both of these games. Now he starts with the black pieces, and Vincent Keymer kicks off here with the move 1d4. Knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, d5. This is the Queen's Gambit declined. And we get to see the exchange variation. C takes d5, e takes d5, bishop g5, pinning the knight, and so does black. So this is potentially a very sharp line. White goes e3, and black goes h6. And this has become recently very popular with the idea that if white would drop back with the bishop to h4, then black's intention is to play g5 to unpin. So the bishop got to go to g3, and after knight to e4, well, the board is already on fire because you're threatening to take on c3, and their idea is also to launch the h-pawn, trying to trap the bishop. A lot of sharp games have been seen with this particular line. But Vincent Keymer has faced this position before, and he decided in that game against Gukesh last year in the tournament in Biel to drop back with the bishop to f4. This may look very strange. You would probably have expected the bishop to go back to h4 to maintain the pin, or if you want to go for a quiet game, there's nothing wrong with bishop takes f6, training off the bishop for the knight. But he has a very interesting idea in mind. Bishop f4, black goes bishop f5, developing the bishop to an active square. White goes bishop d3. So the bishops are getting exchanged. And normally speaking, this is quite okay for black, because black is going to place these pawns on the light squares, and potentially the bishop on c8 would be a vulnerable piece, being restricted by these by its own pawns. It makes sense to have traded it off. White goes knight ge2, and here Magnus comes up with an improvement upon Gukesh, because Gukesh played last year against Keymer the move castling kingside. Very logical move, but now we get to see the main idea behind Keymer's move bishop f4, provoking black to play this move h6, as he went for the move g4. And this is a very aggressive move, as you're trying to play g5 and open up the g file. While in case of knight takes g4, well, there is rook to g1, and things are looking very dangerous as you're pinning the knight. If the knight goes away, you have ideas to take the pawn on h6. This is not what you want to play as black. In the game, Gukesh didn't play knight takes g4. He instead dropped his knight in the center to e4. But after h4, okay, white is getting some nice play going on the king side, whereas it's not clear what black is actually trying to play for. Back to the game. This is the background information we have to know. Magnus was aware of it, and he played here the move knight to h5, attacking the bishop. White doesn't want to let the bishop come off the board. Goes bishop e5, knight d7. So black is about to take on e5 very soon, but white goes h3, and now it's no longer very interesting for black to take on e5, because after d takes e5, the pawn prevents the knight from getting back into the game. White is about to play g4 on the next move when the knight will be trapped. So probably still home preparation by both, or at least they have seen these ideas before. Black decides to drop back with the knight to f6. The knight has done its job at the side of the board, and now black is threatening to take on e5. So white goes back with the bishop to h2. That's another advantage of playing the move h3. Black castles. White goes a3, questioning the bishop, and the bishop has different options. You don't really want to give up the bishop for the knight. There's no need to do that. Bishop e7 is a absolutely fine possibility. Magnus goes for a move bishop a5, and his idea is to go with the bishop to c7 very soon after to trade off the bishops. White castled kingside, black goes rook e8, and here rook ac1 was played. Frankly, it's very understandable to place a rook on the half-open file, but I don't think there's any need to reveal your intentions with the rooks yet. For me, more logical would be to start with the move b4, and then later on you can still decide what to do with that rook from a1. Maybe you need the rook later here to support the advance of the pawns. Okay, rook ac1 played, queen e7. White goes b4 now. And now, okay, with the queen on e7, bishop c7 is no longer possible, of course. You cannot offer the exchange of bishops, as white is just going to take it. If you go to b6, maybe knight a4 is a little bit annoying, with the idea not to take the bishop, but rather to come in with the knight to c5 and put pressure against the pawn on b7. If black is going to take the knight, you recapture with the b pawn, and you will shift the attention to the b file to exert pressure against the backward pawn on b7. So next move by Magnus looks a bit odd, but he goes for the move bishop d8. The bishop is disconnecting the rooks, but it's just momentarily, because now if white would go knight a4, for instance, the idea is to go knight b6. Exchanging the knights is not a problem at all. You can recapture with the a pawn, and the rook becomes active. While in case of knight c5 now, there is knight c4, and the knight is fantastically anchored on this square, can never be chased away by any of white's pawns. So this didn't happen. Knight g3 was played, so the knight is on its way to f5. Now the bishop goes to c7. The bishop is back where it belongs. Knight f5, attacking the queen. You can take on h2 first with check. No time to capture the queen. King takes h2, queen e6. And now we have a position with major pieces and knights only. And I think objectively the position is more or less even here. Black will probably maybe consider something like knight e4 to attack the knight on f5. So therefore the knight goes back to g3. It was not such a stable square. Queen d6. So the knight is pinned. Nothing dangerous yet, but you would like to move your knight whenever you would like to do so. So king g1 back. And now queen d6 was not only with the idea to pin the knight on g3, but also to play here the move a5. You see, pawn on a3 as well as the pawn on b4, they are both targets. And here you can understand that maybe the rook would have been better off still on a1 to keep the queenside pawns guarded. And white doesn't want to make any concession by taking on a5 or playing b5. Decided to go back with the queen to b1 to stay in touch with the pawn on b4. And here my preferred move would be to play b5 to get rid of that backward pawn, with the idea to go knight b6, knight c4. I really like that knight on c4, attacking the pawn on a3. And maybe later on you can continue with the plan of doubling rooks on the a file, then capture on b4 with pressure on the a file. Black is dictating the course of the game. At least that's what I think. Magnus wanted to play it in a slightly different way. Played here the move knight b6 right away. But now Keymer decided to take b takes a5, knight c4. Don't take that poison pawn on b7. It runs into rook e to b8, and the queen is just trapped. Cannot go to any good square. So that was not the idea. Queen b4 was played. So you're offering the exchange of queens. And now rook takes a5 on the board. I think this is a nice move, and if black does get some time, he will probably take the pawn on a3, or maybe just double the rooks on the a file. Positionally speaking, that pawn on the a file is long-term weakness from white's perspective. But the key move here, and this was calculated by Keymer in advance, he played here the move knight takes d5. This is a very nice tactical shot, with the point that you are destroying black's structure. After queen takes d5, it's rook takes c4, and white is in good shape. If you would take with the c pawn to keep the knight protected, there is rook takes c4, and you regain the piece, with the point that after d takes c4, the queen on d6 is no longer protected by that knight on c4. In case of queen takes b4, it's rook takes b4, and black is a pawn down. So not sure Magnus overlooked it, but definitely from positional perspective, I think this is something black should not really want to allow. After knight takes d5, which was played in the game, there followed queen takes c4, rook takes a3. So material is even again, but we have a huge imbalance in structure. Black has two nice pawns on the queen side, white has pawns in the center, and depends. In certain cases, the central pawns are better. Sometimes the flank pawns can also come forward and generate counterplay by creating a passed pawn. So queen c5 was played. Very nice move, offering the exchange of queens, because black cannot avoid the exchange of queens as rook will be hanging. Queen takes c5, rook takes c5, rook a to e8, knight f5. White is trying to play in the center, activates the knight, and well, black would like to keep the option open to play g6 and kick that knight out, but pawn on h6 will be hanging, so therefore h5 is played first. White goes g4, expanding on the side where he's better, so pawns are getting exchanged. Now the rook goes to the second rank, and after a rook to b1, here we have an interesting moment, as white does allow the exchange of rooks here with the move rook to a1, so no time to win the pawn on b7. But I want to point out that if black really wants, he can even force a draw with the move g6, attacking the knight. If the knight goes away, there's this stunning idea of knight takes e3, f takes e3, and bring the rook to e2. Now the second rook will come to a2 next, and when you get two rooks on the second rank, white cannot do anything against the perpetual check mechanism with these two rooks. The king is cut off, so the white rook can never leave the back rank because of mating ideas. This is an interesting way to force a draw, but Magnus was probably still playing for more than equality. So he played rook a1, rooks were exchanged, king g2, king f8, and here the move g5 was played. I think this is the critical moment of the game, and probably the most shocking moment of the entire fourth round, because it's a sharp game, sharp endgame, which means that both sides are really trying to mobilize their assets. And here black played the move knight to c7, which is a huge oversight by the former world champion. His idea is probably to get a knight to e6, but now they followed the move knight d6, attacking the pawn on b7, and this pawn cannot easily be defended. For instance, if you play here the move rook a7, or also rook b1 is possible, there is rook f5, and all of a sudden you have a lot of problems defending the pawn on f7. There's nothing you can do against rook takes f7 or knight takes f7. If black goes f6, you can just take the pawn. And after king e7, there's this knight fork, knight c8, hitting both the king and rook. If you would go king e6, counterattacking this rook, so if white captures the rook, black takes with its king, there is the intermediate check, rook e5, pawn protects the rook, king goes away, and only then you take the rook. Maybe something like this was missed by Magnus. Also other possibilities, for instance b6, moving the pawn, runs into rook takes c6, that's not an option. In case of knight e6, I think this was likely what Magnus had been calculating. After knight e6, the key move is rook to e5 now. And the pawn on b7 is hanging. If you move the pawn to b5, so it looks dangerous, yeah, you get this passed pawn which can run very fast, but here white has the key idea to play g6 to hit the Achilles heel of black's position. The pawn on f7 cannot move. If you take on g6, rook takes e6, and the knight is gone. And otherwise, white is going to take. And if the knight moves away now, it's rook e8 with checkmate. That is a painful idea. So here, Magnus had to make a huge concession. He doesn't want to allow the pawn to come up the board. He doesn't want to allow rook to f5. Therefore, he went for the move g6, giving up the pawn on b7, but now black's position just collapses. It's not only the pawn on b7, the pawn on c6 is a huge weakness now as well, and will be lost very soon, likely. After rook b1, attacking the knight on b7, white went for knight e8, so the pawn is lost. Rook b5, only move, so that you're trying to win the pawn on g5 in case the rook takes on c6. But very nice technique. You're not interested in taking the second pawn, you just want to win the game with a better knight endgame. So the knight comes back to c6 to cover the b4 square, king e8, knight b4. First things first, pawn is stopped. And then after king e7, you mobilize your pawn chain. This is long-term strength of white's position, and now it's finally mobilized. King d6, king f3, knight e6. So you want to support the pawn on d4. You cannot play e4 too quickly. So first king e2, knight g7. What else should black do? Now e4 can be played. Black goes knight h5, attacking the pawn. And after king f3, everything is very nicely protected again. Knight g7, knight d3, knight h5, king e3. White is not in a rush and the plan is very simple. So that after knight g3, now the pawn goes to d5. And if we were allowed to play 2 more moves, we will go king d4, followed by e5 check, forcing the black king to go backwards. And then the king comes in, and before advancing the pawns any further, we can take the pawn on b5. Note that white is very nicely supporting its pawns. The knight on d3 protects the pawn on f4, so black's knight never has the option to launch a counterattack. Black played king c7, king d4, king b6, but now the knight can come into to e5. You're winning the pawn on f7, and Keymer has very nicely calculated that the b pawn is not dangerous at all, because he can safely take the pawn on f7. The pawn is really fast. Don't play here the move king c3, which is something a lot of amateur players will do, because now there's knight takes e4, and after king takes b3, king c5, all of a sudden black is able to hold this endgame. All the pawns are gone now, but Keymer has seen in advance that he is back in time with its knight. The knight comes to e5, with the point that if you play b2, the pawn is almost queening, but there is knight c4. With a fork, you're giving up the b pawn, and that's game over. Instead, there followed knight e2 check. Now the knight is also attacking the pawn on f4, so king goes to e3. Still the same, if b2, you go knight c4 and the pawn will be taken. So Magnus instead played here the move king b5. Now after the move knight d3, the knight covers the pawn, and these 4 versus 1 should just be convincing enough to finish off the game. Black played knight c3, pawn went to d6, threatening to get promoted, and after king c6, the final move of the game here is e5. The pawn is nicely secured, and if black would, instead of resignation, would have continued here with knight a4, Keymer's idea is just to play f5. Typical breakthrough mechanism. After gf5, it's g6. The g-pawn is unstoppable. In the case of b2, white always has knight takes b2. We can sacrifice the knight for the passed pawn. After knight takes b2, it's g7. And here, black cannot do anything against the promotion of the g-pawn. So this was absolutely shocking, I would say. Magnus blundering in this mini match. He definitely needs to play for a win tomorrow. If he doesn't win the game, he will be out of the World Cup. So let's see what is gonna happen tomorrow. Of course, there are a lot of other interesting games we will also closely follow. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you back soon.